are books that belong to their own time, and there are books that seem to exist beyond time itself. They can be read as history, as philosophy, as sacred scripture, or as monuments of an ancient civilization, and each reading reveals something new. That is why, for millions of people, the Bible remains a book to which they return again and again. Because in returning to its stories, we discover not only a distant past, we encounter ourselves once more, recognizing ever-new human faces within its ancient archetypes. Yet this series is not about the origin of the world, theological controversies, the philology of biblical Hebrew, or the dogmas of faith. Our interest lies elsewhere. Together, we will explore some of the greatest texts of human civilization as a map of the inner world. Our concern is not only the history of nations, but the history of the human soul, the inner conflicts, hopes, fears, and archetypal images that have continued to live within each of us for thousands of years. For to understand any tradition, one must first discover its beginnings. What, then, is the Bible? First of all, it is not a single book, but a vast collection of texts composed over many centuries. At the heart of the Jewish tradition stands the Tanakh. Yet the written text never existed apart from the living memory of the people. Alongside it, a rich oral tradition developed over the centuries as generations of sages reflected upon the meaning of Scripture, debated its interpretation, asked difficult questions, and searched for new answers. In time, these reflections were committed to writing. Thus emerged the Mishnah, and later the Gemara, which together formed the Talmud, one of the central monuments of Jewish spiritual culture. Alongside them grew an immense body of midrashic literature, interpretations, parables, and commentaries that allowed each generation to rediscover the ancient text in its own way. It was within this centuries-long tradition that Jewish mystical thought gradually took shape, reaching its highest expression in the Zohar. It is important to remember that the Zohar did not precede the Bible. It emerged many centuries later as the fruit of a long and profound spiritual journey. As Gershom Scholem, the foremost scholar of Jewish mysticism, observed, mysticism does not appear at the beginning of a religious tradition. It arises only after that tradition has acquired depth, maturity, and inner stability. It is not the beginning of the journey, but one of its highest expressions. A similar insight was offered by Rufus Jones. In his view, the foundation of mystical experience lies not in the outward performance of ritual, but in the direct, inward experience of the divine presence. It is then that an ancient text ceases to be merely a monument of the past and becomes a living companion in dialogue with the human soul. That is why the great texts continue to live. Every generation brings its own questions to them, and each return reveals meanings that had remained unseen before. One of the most common mistakes is to read the Bible either as literal history or, at the opposite extreme, to turn it into a collection of spectacular, mystical legends. Both approaches lead us equally far from its true meaning. Over the past decades, popular culture has created countless romanticized images of Cain, Lucifer, the fallen angels, and other biblical figures. Around them have grown fictional cults, secret seals, pseudo-occult systems, and endless interpretations that reveal far more about the modern imagination than about the ancient texts themselves. From a psychological perspective, such a phenomenon is entirely understandable. We often project our own inner conflicts onto ancient archetypes, transforming them into reflections of our fears, our grievances, or our desire to set ourselves apart from the world around us. Yet these romantic reinterpretations bear little resemblance to the historical tradition. That is precisely why the biblical text demands a far greater degree of humility and care. It cannot be read merely as a literal chronicle. But neither can it be transformed into a fantasy shaped by modern expectations. Every age brings its own questions to an ancient text. Yet the text begins to answer only when we are willing to listen to its own voice. It is here that the first story begins, a story that would profoundly shape the entire course of European culture. And she bore Cain and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. Genesis 4, 1-2. At first glance, everything appears remarkably simple. Two brothers, two human beings, two different callings. One cultivates the earth, the other tends the flocks. Each brings the fruit of his own labor. And it is here that a question is born, a question humanity has continued to ask for thousands of years. Why is one offering accepted while the other is rejected? Before we search for an answer, it is worth pausing over Abel's very name. The Hebrew word hevel means breath, vapor, mist, or a fleeting moment. Within that single word already lies a profound reflection on the fragility of human life and the astonishing swiftness with which it passes. At the same time, scholars increasingly recognize that the biblical narrative did not emerge in a cultural vacuum. It was born within the rich and interconnected world of the ancient Near East, where the traditions of the Sumerians, Akkadians, Canaanites, and many other peoples influenced one another over the course of centuries. That is precisely why so many biblical images prove to be far deeper than they may seem at first reading. But if historical context helps us understand the origins of the biblical text, its psychological depth is revealed on an entirely different level. The story of Cain and Abel is no longer simply the story of two brothers. It is one of humanity's earliest attempts to describe an inner conflict that every person encounters, at least once, within the course of a lifetime. That is why this story can be reduced neither to a literal chronicle nor to a beautiful legend. It speaks about the human being, about each one of us. In analytical psychology, as well as in many mystical traditions, Cain and Abel are understood not as two separate individuals, but as two opposing principles that continually coexist within a single personality. Cain represents the impulse to possess, to dominate, and to assert one's own will. It is the force through which humanity builds civilizations, cultivates the earth, founds nations, and transforms the world around it. Yet, the very same force, and when deprived of inner balance, can easily become the source of envy, rivalry, and destruction. Abel embodies the opposite movement of the soul. He represents the capacity to trust, to sacrifice, to transcend one's own self-interest, and to remain connected with what one perceives as the highest meaning of life. That is why the tragedy of Cain and Abel begins long before the first blow is struck. It begins the moment we cease to recognize ourselves in another, when comparison becomes more important than love, when the desire to possess becomes stronger than the capacity to give. In the Lurianic tradition of Kabbalah, this inner conflict acquires its own symbolic language. Cain becomes associated with the principle of din, judgment, limitation, and severity. Abel represents the opposite movement of the soul, mercy, self-giving, and spiritual ascent. It is important to remember, however, that this is only one possible way of reading the text. The Bible is remarkable precisely because it can never be exhausted by a single interpretation. Every tradition discovers its own meaning within it without invalidating the others. And perhaps that is why the story of the two brothers has remained alive for thousands of years, because it is not ultimately a story about a crime committed in the distant past. It is the story of a struggle that unfolds within every human being, and every time our desire to dominate becomes stronger than our capacity to understand and to love, the story of Cain and Abel begins once again. If the story of Cain and Abel speaks of the inner division within the human soul, then the next great biblical image opens an entirely different chapter. It is no longer the story of conflict, it is the story of a calling. Now, the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your kindred, and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you." Genesis 12:1-2. These few lines mark the beginning of one of the most influential stories in human civilization. Yet their meaning reaches far beyond the ancient narrative itself. For the first time, a human being hears the call to leave behind everything familiar and take a step toward the unknown. That is why Abraham's journey begins long before he sets foot upon the road. It begins with a journey inward. From the perspective of analytical psychology, this call is addressed to every one of us. To leave one's home is, sooner or later, to step beyond one's habitual way of living and thinking, not merely to leave behind walls, but to leave behind one's own fears, to take a step into a place where no guarantees exist, only trust. That is why the story of Abraham continues to speak to us across the centuries. It tells of that singular moment when life ceases to be governed by habit and begins, for the first time, to follow an inner calling. This image is not unique to the biblical tradition. In many Gnostic writings, the human being appears as a traveler who has forgotten his own true nature. The call is always the same: wake up, remember who you are, return to yourself. And perhaps that is why Abraham's journey can be understood as the beginning of the greatest journey of all, the journey into one's own soul. It is no coincidence that later Jewish tradition preserves another story. According to the legend, King Nimrod was told that one of Abraham's descendants would one day bring an end to his reign. Fearing the fulfillment of the prophecy, Nimrod resolved to destroy the future threat before it could even be born. Whether we should understand this account as history or as symbolic tradition, we cannot say with certainty. Its psychological meaning, however, is remarkably precise. Whenever a person begins to change inwardly, the old order seems instinctively to sense the danger. Whatever has governed our lives for so long rarely surrenders its place without resistance. That is why every genuine inner transformation is almost always accompanied by opposition. Edward Edinger observed that the motif of the calling is one of the central images of spiritual development. It demands that we leave behind former authorities, familiar certainties, and those structures of power to which we have unconsciously submitted throughout our lives. Perhaps that is why this pattern returns again and again throughout the history of human culture. We encounter it in the story of Abraham, later in the story of Moses, later still in the gospel narrative. Each time, the birth of a new path is met by the resistance of the old world. Psychologically, it is always the same archetype. A new self is never born without first bidding farewell to the old one. After a long journey, the Bible once again brings us to Abraham's encounter with Yahweh. "Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward." Genesis 15:1. Sometime later, an event takes place that becomes one of the defining moments of the entire biblical narrative. The covenant is established, the sacred bond between God and humanity. "Unto thy descendants have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates." Genesis 15:18. To the modern reader, the description of this event may seem unusual. For the peoples of the ancient Near East, however, such a ceremony was well known. When entering into a covenant of the highest importance, sacrificial animals were divided in two. By passing between the severed halves, the participants declared, in effect, "May the same be done to me if I fail to keep my word." Yet it is precisely here that the biblical narrative transforms the ancient ritual into something entirely new. It is not a human being who passes between the sacrifices. It is the symbolic presence of Yahweh revealed in the image of smoke and a quiet flame that moves through the altar. The covenant is no longer merely an agreement between two parties. It becomes the sign that the initiative of this union proceeds not only from humanity, but from the divine itself. That is why the covenant becomes far more than a historical event. It becomes the image of that moment when a person consciously chooses to follow an inner calling. It is no longer a chance encounter, no longer a passing revelation, nor merely an emotional impulse. It is a freely embraced decision to continue along a chosen path, even when that path still disappears into the unknown. It is here that the words of Carl Gustav Jung acquire a remarkable depth. It is quite possible that we contain within ourselves entire peoples, entire worlds, where we may be as great inwardly as we appear small outwardly. These worlds are so vast that the story of the redemption of an entire people, or even of the whole universe, may take place within us. If this is indeed so, then the story of Abraham ceases to be the story of a single man. It becomes the story of everyone who has once heard an inner calling and found the courage to answer it. Yet it is precisely here that the Bible takes its next unexpected step. It turns out that a genuine encounter between the human being and the divine does not end with obedience. It becomes the beginning of a conversation. After the covenant has been established, an event takes place that unexpectedly transforms the entire relationship between Abraham and Yahweh. Abraham no longer merely listens, he begins to speak. When he learns of the coming destruction of Sodom, he turns to God with a question that has troubled the human conscience for thousands of years. Can the innocent perish for the sake of the guilty? And if even a few righteous people are found among the many, can there truly be no room for mercy? What follows is a remarkable conversation. Abraham does not rebel. He does not reject the will of God. Instead, he persistently seeks a way to preserve life. Again and again he returns to the same question, as though trying to defend before eternity itself humanity's right to hope. And it is here that something extraordinary takes place. The Bible does not portray the human being as a silent servant. It portrays a human being who dares to enter into dialogue with God, not out of pride, not from the desire to prove himself right, but out of compassion, out of the capacity to experience the suffering of others as one's own. Perhaps this is one of the deepest insights in the entire biblical narrative. True faith does not destroy human freedom. It gives birth to responsibility. The responsibility to ask questions, the responsibility to seek justice, the responsibility not to pass indifferently by the fate of another. From the perspective of analytical psychology, it is here that the personality reaches a new level of maturity. The highest inner authority is no longer experienced as a force demanding blind obedience. It becomes a partner in dialogue. That is why Abraham is remembered not only as a man of faith, he becomes a man of conscience, and perhaps that is why this ancient conversation still speaks so powerfully to the modern world, because each of us sooner or later finds ourselves facing the same choice: to accept what happens in silence, or to find the courage to stand up for another human being. Before we go any further, however, one important historical observation must be made. Whenever we read ancient texts, we inevitably see them through the eyes of the 21st century. For that reason, many of the actions of biblical figures may strike us today as puzzling or even deeply contradictory. Yet the world of the ancient Near East was governed by an entirely different set of assumptions. Its understanding of family, authority, law, and social order shaped the very fabric of everyday life. One need only look at the Code of Hammurabi to appreciate how profoundly ancient concepts of justice and morality differed from those we hold today. That is why history, archaeology, and the comparative study of ancient civilizations are so essential. They do not ask us to justify the past, they help us understand it. They return the biblical text to the world in which it was first written, allowing us to see not only its spiritual meaning, but also the living civilization from which it emerged. The story of the Bible neither begins here nor, of course, does it end here. Ahead of us lie the stories of Moses and the Exodus, of prophets and kings, of exile and return, of the birth of new spiritual traditions, and of the long journey through which humanity's understanding of God gradually evolved. Together, we will explore how the religious consciousness of ancient Israel changed over time, why, as modern historical research increasingly suggests, the worship of Yahweh itself underwent a long process of development, and how these transformations shaped not only the history of a people but also the history of human consciousness. Yet whatever period we explore, our true subject will never be history alone. Our true subject will always be the human being, for great texts remain alive only as long as we are still able to recognize ourselves within them. Perhaps that is why, after thousands of years, we continue to return to these pages, not in search of ready-made answers, but to learn how to ask better questions. For every genuine journey begins with a question. Thank you for taking this first step with me. If this way of looking at history, mythology, psychology, and spiritual tradition resonates with you, I would be delighted to welcome you to the next episodes of Noesis Mysteria. Before we part, I would like to leave you with one final question. Has there ever been a moment in your life when you felt an inner calling to leave behind what was familiar and take a step into the unknown? Perhaps it is in moments like these that the journey the ancient texts call awakening truly begins. Until next time.